It is the Awesemo MLB live before lock, and hey, it's a Corbin Burns day. That's always nice for me. Also, today's show is sponsored by Jock Market. Never an issue with that. Also, a Saturday, got NFL football coming up. But Terry, we got about an hour here to talk about baseball. How you doing today?
Doing pretty good. It's been a just day kind of largely focused on this slate. Wrote about it earlier, put my article together, been poking around with some lineup builds. Took the dog for a walk, came back, started building more lineups. So yeah, I've been very focused on this. I think it's a really interesting slate.
Yeah, a lot of Corbin Burns, and rightfully so. I think a lot of people are aware who follow me on Twitter. I'm fairly invested in Corbin Burns to win Cy Young this year, and he's going to have to match Max Scherzer because if you look at the underlying numbers, Burns has been quite a bit better than Scherzer this year. However, Scherzer, some of the traditional stats some of the voters like to look at, and Scherzer has basically been unhittable over the last 6 weeks or so since getting traded to the Dodgers, and he pitched another gem earlier today. So Corbin Burns in a good situation to match him today against the Chicago Cubs. But I think that's where we need to start is Corbin Burns, play him in cash games. Nothing to even talk about. You're playing him in cash games. Tournaments. You're playing him in tournaments too, but the question is how much. He's currently projected for 56% ownership on DraftKings. On FanDuel, Corbin Burns is projected for 28.6% ownership. The matchup against the Chicago Cubs could not be more favorable. But Terry, how are you going to be handling Burns in the ownership?
So I think it's the rare one of these where I'll probably come in on FanDuel, at least. I think I would come in kind of around the field, 25-ish%, maybe 20, maybe undercut it a little bit because there are a bunch of good pitchers on this slate. I mean, we've got 5 or 6 potential guys that could go out and easily get to that top score on the night. So while I think Burns is by far the best play, makes sense even at his price, even at his popularity, I do want to spread some of that around. But he's just such a good pitcher in such a good spot against a weak lineup. The worst strikeout rate in the league against right-handed pitching. He strikes out 35.4% of hitters. He only walks 4.9%, 2.31 xFIP, a 0.91 whip on the season, 16.4% induced swinging strike rate, 34.1% CSW percentage, a 2.6% barrel rate. These go on and on and on. He's just been spectacular. The price is definitely right on DK. 10.5 is cheap over there. That's why he's pulling more than half the field to own him. But on FanDuel, I think 27-ish%, 28% ownership might be a little bit low for the spot and for the just general upside that he creates. He's got a monster projection in my model. He's leading our top stacks tool. It's just about that leverage, but I think it's just such a good enough spot that I do want to have a lot of it. So a little difficult to gauge, but I think at or about the field is probably appropriate here.
Yeah, so for me personally, I'm not playing on FanDuel tonight. I am playing on DraftKings. I have Corbin Burns in 75% of my lineups right now. And that's about where I'm going to be, give or take a few percentage points, depending what happens when we have to refresh lineups once all the lineups come out. But yeah, I'm going to be super heavy on Corbin Burns. I think that there's not really a way around it. Somebody in Slack chat had said, where was it? Seth Hader saying that he's playing Nola over Burns in FanDuel cash. I vehemently disagree. And it's not even to say that relative to his price tag, Nola can't end up having a better game. Clearly he can. And he's going to be the second most popular pitcher on FanDuel today. But Corbin Burns is at home against the Chicago Cubs, and that is as safe of a floor as you could possibly get. Weird things happen in baseball from time to time. But I get there's a pretty big price gap here. He's still going to be popular in his own right. Nola, do you see a case to go to Nola in cash games over Burns on FanDuel?
No, I think Burns is the easy pick here. We've got a bunch of cheap bats that we can work with. All the teams stacked together pretty well today. It's just so easy to put together an affordable lineup with Burns in it as the pitcher that I don't see the need to pivot down to Nola. I think Nola's in a very good spot here going up the Mets against the Mets. I love the 8,300 price on FanDuel. Don't get me wrong. I think that's a very, very dramatic misprice for a guy who's striking out hitters at almost a 30% rate on the season and has been largely very good. I know the ERA is a little bit bumpy, but overall on the season, 163 innings, a 3.38 xFIP for Nola, 29.9% strikeout rate, 5.2% walks. He's right there. He's been excellent in terms of those numbers. It's just that Burns has been so much better than even that and is in a much stronger matchup than the Mets are league average-ish, where you get that Cubs team that they can hit the ball out of the park. They've got a few guys with a little bit of power, but they create runs 12% worse than average, and they strike out at a 26.2% clip against righties, where the Mets are at 24.5. That's a big enough difference to make a difference. The Mets create runs 6% worse than average. That's a big enough difference to make a difference. So I just think the spot is that much stronger for Burns. It's coming through in my model. It's coming through in our projections. For cash games, I think it just makes sense.
Yeah, and then something else I just have to point out about Nola in this matchup against the Cubs. In our player prop model, not this rates out as a strong bet, but we have positive ROI on Corbin Burns for over 8.5 strikeouts today, and that's with juice towards the over. 8.5, it's minus 120 on the over. We still like the 12% ROI. It's not something I would recommend betting, but it just goes to show what kind of strikeout upside there is in Corbin Burns. Something else too, this is arguably one of the best pitching seasons in baseball history. The numbers are so ridiculous on Corbin Burns. He has a 2.25 ERA, and that's only because of bad luck. He has a 1.9 expected ERA, a 1.5 FIP. These are absolutely absurd numbers. If it wasn't for him missing some starts early in the year, because I believe he was in the COVID protocol because of contact tracing, if it wasn't for him missing some of those starts, I mean, his numbers would just be so ridiculous this year. I mean, we'd be talking about a guy who could potentially be approaching a 10-win season as a pitcher. So, I mean, Corbin Burns, to me, he's the clear top option for cash games. And I mean, we could talk about Aaron Nola as a potential pivot play for tournaments, but I mean, 26.8% ownership for Nola. It's not like he's some crazy pivot play based on ownership here. So I'm seeing some people bring that up in the chat, but I think if anything, Nola's going over owned relative to Burns.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's all about that strong discount on the FanDuel slate at 8,300. That's just a misprice for all the quality that we just talked about with Nola. I think he's much more appropriately priced at 9,800 over on DK, where he's going to be popular over there as well. 32% ownership, less than Burns, obviously, but I think it's still a strong number. And yeah, it's probably pushing toward negative leverage territory. I have to pull up the updated version of the top pitchers. I was just getting my crunch going here, but yeah, it looks like he's significantly over leveraged on the FanDuel slate and coming in a little closer to efficiently owned on the DK slate, but definitely into negative leverage territory there. So I think it's a very strong spot for him. I do think it's a broken price that's worth owning on FanDuel in tournaments, but I don't know that I would go to the field with Nola because I think he's a guy, like, I expect Burns to rocket through the top of this slate. That's the most probable outcome to me. And then I expect a group of Lance Lynn, Darvish, Lance McCullers, Aaron Nola, maybe Charlie Morton, maybe Adam Wainwright, all to be in a FanDuel like 35, 45 point range, somewhere in that territory with Burns up above them. So I'll take a big spread and just try and play the ownership game among those 5 or 6 other guys while taking a gigantic share of Burns on the side of that. And within that, Nola definitely needs to take a bit of a haircut in that ownership to be able to spread it around enough to those other guys.
So then I think where we really have to talk about actual pivot plays, here are the guys who are picking up less ownership than Nola and Burns, which is everybody else on the slate from a pitcher perspective. But DK and FanDuel, these are the next tier of pitchers as far as ownership goes. Charlie Morton, Lance McCullers, Lance Lynn, Darvish. That's the next guys that were in the next price tier. Of that group, which ones do you like?
So just going by our leverage numbers, because I do think we're going to need it tonight. There are some decent stacks with positive leverage, or at least last time I had that still in front of me. But I do think we're going to need to play the leverage game with only a handful of games on the slate. And Charlie Morton stands out for positive leverage on that DraftKings slate at a fair price for Charlie Morton. He's going up against a really tough San Francisco lineup. They've been deadly all year long. We've talked about it a lot. But just pulling them up now against right-handed pitching, they are at a 24.4% strikeout rate. So that's a below average mark. It's the only real below average mark they have across either hand. They have a 206 ISO. They have a 112 WRC plus. So they create runs 12% better than average. They have a 4.61% home run rate against righties, but they do strike out. Morton's a talented enough guy that I believe that the ownership is at least inefficient enough that it makes sense to get over the field on him because he's going to succeed more than that in this spot. I think he gets through this lineup more than that in this spot, at least safely enough where he gets some strikeout upside and he pitches fairly clean. Overall in the season, 3.25 xFIP, a 1.05 whip. He induces swinging strikes at a 12.3% rate. He walks 7.6% of hitters, but he strikes out 28.5, 5.1% barrel rate, only a 32.5% hard hit. So he's a guy who can effectively limit the power and the upside that the Giants do have here. So I like Morton with that lack of ownership on him there. 8,500 on the FanDuel slate is a pretty fair price. Not getting much ownership there, below 10% on both sites. I think he makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, so for me, my intuition is to go towards Lance Lynn. He's currently projected for 20% ownership on DK. On FanDuel, we have Lance Lynn projected for just 2% ownership. His price tag also a little elevated there at 10,300. I'm just not exactly sure what to expect in terms of pitch count. We've seen the White Sox be ridiculously conservative with their guys down the stretch. The reason being is they're up like a million games in their division. It was like the third week of the season. It's like, all right, the White Sox won the division. They've locked up their playoff spot. So with that in mind, second half of the season, they've hardly pitched Carlos Rodon. They've hardly pitched Lance Lynn. They've put them on the injured list, which is bogus injuries. Both these guys have been fine, and they've looked fine when they've been on the mound. It's just been a case of, hey, we're set for the playoffs. We're going to make sure that we're prepared for it. We're going to make sure our arms are healthy. So with that in mind, I just don't know how deep Lance Lynn is going to go into the game. 20% on DK to 8,700 price tag, only 2% ownership on FanDuel. I'm overweight to it. I'm a little bit scared, except I still think that there's enough upside here due to the matchup against Texas. And who knows, he's in the Cy Young mix. Maybe that's enough reason for him to tell the team, hey, I really want to get my 6 innings in here to try to boost my counting stats. But an 8,700 price tag on Lance Lynn, if this is 2 months ago, he's the second most popular pitcher on the slate behind Corbin Burns. It just isn't the case because of some of those pitch count concerns. So how deep do you think Lynn is going today?
So that's the concern. You hit it right on the head. I wrote about it a little bit in the tournament strategy article. I think he looks great for price on DK. I think he looks great for ownership on FanDuel. He's my second highest pitcher on my board going up against his former Rangers team here. Nothing not to like about the matchup. Maybe you could quibble with the fact that their active roster, 23.3% strikeout rate, a little bit above average in terms of their ability to limit strikeouts, but they create runs 18% worse than average. They have a 3.03% home run rate, 142 ISO. Essentially a powerless offense. So I expect in a normal situation, Lance Lynn would cruise through 7 to 8 innings, rack up 8 to 10 strikeouts against this team and have no problem putting up a very, very nice score. It's just that they're probably going to limit him, like you were saying. I fully expect that. He went 5 innings in his August 28th start, took 2 weeks off, went 5 innings when he came back. And Lynn is a guy who typically does pitch deep into games. He goes 6 with regularity. He'll usually get into the 7th inning, and complete games are on the board for him a lot of the time. Now, in that 5-inning start against Boston on the 12th when he first came back, he had 2 hits in that game and struck out 9. So he's got the talent to put up a very good start here for us in only 5 innings. Is it going to be enough to rival something that Corbin Burns might go out and do, Aaron Nola might go out and do in a deeper start in similarly good matchups? That's where I start to question it. So at the price tag, I definitely want to be over 2% ownership. I'll be at 10, 12, something like that. But I don't know that I want to push it much more than that. I do want to be over the field on him, but I think there's enough innings concern there where I start to worry about it a little bit.
So let's do the Darvish conversation, because I mean, the guy still generates swing and misses, but his results leave a lot to be desired in the second half of the season. And Darvish, I'll pull up his splits, which once again, he's generating strikeouts, but he is giving up so much hard contact now in the second half of the season. And it's becoming quite an issue, especially from a fantasy perspective, where he's scoring like negative fantasy points as a popular pitcher with an expensive price tag every slate recently. But second half of the year, Darvish still maintaining a 26.7% K rate. That is down from the 29.8% he had in the first half of the year. But the real concern here is just the amount of hard contact. He's giving up 5.77 FIP in the second half of the season. His ERA in the second half of the season equally not great, sitting at 7.2. So not that I expect a 7.2 ERA to be maintained, but he's a 5.77 FIP. He's giving up a lot of home runs. So the xFIP looks lower, except home runs have been a little bit of an issue. So that's where that looks out of whack to me. But where do you think Darvish is right now? Because I just don't know what he has left in the tank at this point. There are times where he's pitching in, like last time out, where he legitimately looks terrible.
Yeah, so the power is what concerns me here, and maybe it's a little bit of happenstance, just losing a few pitches, a few mistakes a game. But over the 45-inning sample that we're calling the second half on Fangraphs there, 14 home runs given up to 195 total batters faced. That's over a 7% home run rate for the second half of the season in that 45-inning sample. First half of the season, over 105 innings, 419 batters faced. He gave up 13 home runs. That would be one fewer. That would have been a 3.10 home run rate in the first half. So just dramatically different. Home runs can be weird. Home runs can be a little bit of a wonky stat. But to me, it definitely in the stat line at least looks like there's some concern here, something to be worried about with whether it's mechanical or whatever it might be. There is something that's getting out and making him make those mistakes and getting the power upside on the bat. So I'm a little concerned about it. It hasn't really translated through my model, so he does still project well for me. But if I was taking a guy not out of consideration, but if I had to rank these guys, he would probably be at the bottom of my board out of those top end pitchers. That said, I think he could have a good start here against this Cardinals lineup. There's no real reason to fear this lineup. They've got, we talked about it a bunch of times. They've got a few guys like Goldschmidt, Arenado, who are not necessarily performing to who they are or who we expected them to be. They've got Tyler O'Neill in that lineup. He's having a great year. But outside of that, it's kind of an underperforming lineup. 8% worse than average against righties in creating runs, a 3.40% home run rate, a 154 team ISO. They are good avoiding strikeouts, 22.2% strikeout rate against righties. So you get that additional concern on there. You get a semi-dysfunctional Darvish. You get a few guys in the opposing lineup who do know how to hit home runs. It's kind of mishmash. I'm not entirely sure. I definitely would look to undercut the field, though. I mean, 21% on DK. I don't think you need to go there at 9,100. Same price on FanDuel. If he's owned at 10, 12% and I'm half that, I think I'm probably okay.
Yeah. So of the expensive pitchers on DK today, he's the one I'm the lowest on. I prefer Corbin Burns, obviously, Lance Lynn, Aaron Nola, Charlie Morton, Lance McCullers. I have more exposure to all of these guys than I do to Darvish, and it's just the results have not been good, and a lot of it's been in easy matchups. Here are his recent starts against bad offenses. The Angels, that was a good result, 27 fantasy points. The Diamondbacks, -3 fantasy points. The Diamondbacks, again, -0.2 fantasy points. Then he gets the Diamondbacks and scores 33. That's a good result. Time for that at home against the Rockies. That should be a simple matchup. 15 fantasy points against the Marlins in Miami. He ends up scoring 11 in that game. At home against Washington, he scores -6. He's had a couple of good starts here, but by and large part, he's really gotten crushed by some bad offenses. That's pretty concerning. That and this spot against the Cardinals, it's a team that, well, it's a right-hand dominant lineup, so that doesn't really present an issue. They don't strike out a lot, so I'm not exactly sure what we could expect in terms of upside from you, Darvish. He's not in 0% of my lineups, but I'm well under the field on him. Like I said, I'm heavier on all of those other pitchers that are priced around him. Lance McCullers, Charlie Morton, Aaron Nola, Lance Lynn, Corbin Burns, all higher priorities to me than Darvish is. So let's talk about some of the cheaper pitchers here that we have on the slate, Terry. And to be honest, I'm mostly prioritizing paying up for pitching. I'm not digging into the value plays too much. We do have a lot of people in the chat bring up they really like Adam Wainwright as a play, and I don't really roster Adam Wainwright that much. And it's not because I think he's a bad pitcher. I think he's definitely a good pitcher, especially at this point in his career. It's pretty remarkable. But he's 9,400 on FanDuel. Over on DK, Adam Wainwright is 8,400. We don't have him projected that well, and I think he's a very high floor guy. I don't think the ceiling is that significant towards him. So that's really what's preventing me from rostering him. I don't really see a legitimate upside considering his lack of strikeouts this year. But where do you stand on him?
Yeah, so I think throughout the year I've gotten to him a little bit more than you have, and maybe more aggressively than some of the other guys at the site. And it's come and gone as far as whether it pays off. He does have occasional bursts where he'll have an 8 strikeout game and be a high scoring starter. Anytime he's going to be owned at like a 2% rate on the FanDuel slate, though, I'm happy to take that up to 8 to 10, something like that. It's pretty easy to do on this slate. 8,400 and only drawing under 5% ownership on DK. I just think that's a tidy price to get him at and nobody on him, that there's enough upside where you can exploit that. I think, as an SP2, he's super functional at that price, at that rate. It's not the greatest matchup in the world against the Padres here. They're pretty good at avoiding strikeouts as well. So a lot of these teams we've talked about are against right-handed pitching, 21.1% rate. But there might surprise some people. They create runs 1% worse than average against righties, only a 3.38% home run rate, which is below average, a 160 ISO, which is right around maybe a little bit below average. So it's not been the Padres offense that maybe a lot of people expected throughout the season. I think he's, like you said, probably more of a high floor, low ceiling guy, but I think you can get away with that as an SP2 for that price on the DK slate. So I don't mind that.
Yeah, it's. I was looking through Adam Wainwright, and by the way, some of Wainwright's he has had a few good games this year. Almost all of them come against the Pirates, which I mean, maybe that's not particularly surprising. I was looking through, I was like, oh, here's some of the outlier games for Adam Wainwright. It's August 22nd against the Pirates, August 11th against the Pirates. Then you go back to one good game of June 20th against the Braves. He's only scored over 25 fantasy points against a playoff team once this entire season. There's been a whole lot of starts where he's been good but not great, where he scores 17 to 20 fantasy points. Not an outcome you're going to be upset about, but also not one that's going to win you a tournament. So there's so many good high-end pitchers with strikeout upside that he ultimately just ends up getting pinched for me because of that overall lack of upside. He does rate out as positively leveraged in our top pitchers tool, though. We have him currently at 8.7% projected ownership on DK with a 12.5% chance of going to the top 2 scoring pitchers. Over on FanDuel, we have him with 2% projected ownership, 7.5% chance to be to be the top scoring pitcher. So he does rate out as positive leverage. I'm just not sure that the upside comes frequently enough for me to get there. But let's talk about some of these cheap pitchers now. Is there any value option that you really like as an arm today?
I'm kind of with you. I would cap it at going down the ladder. I would stop at like the Wainwright and Alex Wood tier. And I prefer Wainwright to Alex Wood going up against that Braves lineup. I just give them a little bit more credit. If I'm dumpster diving, I get a decent little projection, but I haven't really looked into it very much on Yusei Kikuchi going up against that Royals team. He's only 7,000 on the slate. Let me look where he is on our board. I didn't notice him standing out on our board here. Is he on this? There he is, because he wasn't ranked that high. Getting positive leverage on him on the DK slate for that price, I don't mind that all that much. Like I said, I didn't really look into it earlier in the day, but you're talking about a Kansas City lineup, 3.19% home run rate, a 148 team ISO, create runs exactly at league average against lefties. The one thing they do really well, though, is avoid strikeouts. They rival the Astros, 18.8% strikeout rate against left-handed pitching. That's an excellent mark. So tough to strike out, not a ton of power or home run upside. They get on base against him, though. It becomes concerning. But that's, at least for price, one that kind of maybe stands out a little bit as advantageous with no ownership on it whatsoever.
Yeah, and by the way, we've got in the chat. I'm going to disagree with somebody here about overall paying up for pitching, but Brandon Furlow is saying that winning GPPs is strictly based off batters unless a pitcher gets a complete game shutout. Here are some recent outings that Corbin Burnes has had where he has not had a complete game shutout. Last time out against Cleveland, he scored 49 fantasy points. That was not a complete game shutout. Against San Francisco, 31 fantasy points. Also not a complete game shutout. Last time he pitched against the Cubs, he scored 49.6 fantasy points. That was also not a complete game shutout. Pitchers can definitely break slates without a complete game shutout, and Corbin Burnes is fairly likely to do that, all things considered, in this spot. So I think that you definitely have to consider pitchers probably even more heavily than offenses. Like, to me, I'm generally looking at the quality of pitchers. I'm looking at leverage for offense and ownership. Pitchers, I mean, that comes into play as well. Some of the ownership, obviously, and leverage, except pitchers, I think, are a little more reliable to predict than batters' outcomes.
Absolutely. I mean, I use pitchers to dictate the entire slate, basically. I'm looking at pitchers that I want to roster. I'm looking at pitchers that I want to target with bats. And then I start looking into, all right, how do these stacks line up in terms of cost, in terms of ownership, in terms of how things fit together? But 100% to me, pitching is the most important thing to pay attention to. It kind of dictates everything about what's going to happen in that game, including what the Vegas line is going to be. It's absurd to think that pitching doesn't matter.
Yeah. So anyway, I disagree with that. And especially, I mean, if you don't think pitching matters, fine. Just don't play Corbin Burnes today because he's going to be popular. And maybe it'll work out.
$5,400 shares of Chris Bubich then, if pitching doesn't matter? I mean, is that what we're doing here?
Actually, I mean, if you have to play a cheap SP2 on DK, I mean, the guy would be Bubich, I guess. This is a slate where I'm mostly paying up for pitching. The cheapest pitcher I have exposure to today is Bubich. He's in 4% of my lineups. But that's not really saying much. That's just like, hey, here's, I guess, the lineup where I'm paying up for an offense, and here's Chris Bubich because he's cheap. I really didn't pay up I really didn't spend that much money on pitcher today. I didn't find it to be necessary for this particular slate.
Yeah, I think both sites are just pricing hitters down a little bit over these last couple of weeks. Maybe they're not paying enough attention, but like we get the White Sox pretty cheap again. There's some weird ones where like the Mariners are really priced up today on the other side of that Chris Bubich game. I actually wrote about them because they're coming at significant positive leverage on the DK slate because they've got 4 hitters at the top of their lineup, 5 hitters at the top of their lineup, priced over 5,000. And then across town, they're owned through the roof because they're priced in the 2,000. So it's just a weird slate in terms of those prices. But you can get to discounted good bats on both sites where I think it just makes sense where you can pay up to pitching and not really have to worry about it. So I did actually write up the Mariners on the other side of Bubich there. So I don't really know that I want any part of him, but I guess if you're going to a super cheap pitcher, I get concerned about a guy with an 11.2% walk rate, a guy who gives up 39.9% hard hit, 9% barrel rate, only strikes out 21%. Not too likely to come through, but out of the guys that are at that price range, you have to think that Seattle's the worst opponent out of the White Sox, the Astros. Maybe you throw the Angels into that bucket, then the Angels would be the second worst, but I think the Mariners would be the worst team on that list. So just from that regard, it makes sense that Chris Bubich would be the guy.
Yeah, and it's also kind of by default because I'm going to read off the cheap. Yeah. By the way, also I have to add, the Mariners are my second most rostered offense today. So I'm very high on them as a stack. We'll hit on them in a second because we're about to wrap up pitchers here. But here are the cheap pitching options we have to choose from today on DK. And FanDuel, I think this is a total non-necessity. But if you're dumpster diving for an SP2 on DK, these are the cheap pitchers we have to choose from that are priced under 7,000. Chris Bubic, Justin Steele, Jose Suarez, Humberto Castellanos, Spencer Howard. Yuck. It's a really bad group of pitchers. So just by default, the guy kind of becomes Bubic. And once again, that means I get to him in 4% of my lineups. But yeah, there's not really too much else to say here. Anything you want to add about pitcher before we move on?
Yeah, I mean, just as you're reading through that list of names, I think it is important to tag, like, somebody might hear Spencer Howard. He's at that price level and think, 24% strikeout rate. That's better than Bubic. And they walk a similar amount. He walks 11.7. He's going up against the White Sox. That is not going to be a good outing for Spencer Howard here. He is very likely to get tattooed by this team. So I would definitely agree. It's by a nose hair, it's Chris Bubic, and I don't like it, and I don't like saying it. But if you're going to that level, which you probably don't have to do, that's probably the guy.
All right, we can move on to some offenses, some stacks. If you guys have more questions, throw them in. And by the way, just because we disagree with you doesn't mean we don't love you. And you should love us too. So like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel. A lot of football content coming up tomorrow. And then, of course, throughout the year. But today's sponsor, Jock Market. If you guys are new to Jock Market, download the app, check it out. Different way to play daily fantasy sports. There's no lineup construction. There's no kind of salary restrictions. It's a stock market, but for athletes. So that's why it's called the Jock Market. So there's an IPO period. You bid on players. You try to win shares of them. Then the slate starts. You could buy and sell players after the games have already begun. So you could change your lineups or your exposure to players as the slate goes on, which is something you can't do on other sites. That's something that makes it unique. If you're heading on over to the site for the first time, use the promo code Awesemo and get up to a $50 bonus on your first deposit. But also, there's a lot of stuff there. There's a lot of information and a little unfamiliar, maybe DFS site. They do have a lot of free contests that you could win some money on. So that's another way you could dip your toes in the water before using that promo code Awesemo, making your first deposit. But let's head on over to the offenses now, Terry. And let's start with Seattle Mariners because we kind of alluded to liking them just a second ago. They are my second most rostered offense today on DK, so I like them quite a bit. You seem to like them also. Why are we stacking against Chris Bubic today?
Yeah, so it's partly about the things I pointed out just a minute ago about Chris Bubic. 21% strikeout rate, walks 11.2%, 9% barrel rate, and a 39.9% hard hit. That all adds up to a guy who is very targetable for run creation. He's going to put people on base. He's got a 1.49 whip on the season, a 4.60 xFIP. He doesn't throw enough strikes, only a 27% CSW percentage. And the Mariners are, I don't know necessarily, they're probably properly rated in terms of how we think of them as a team, but they've got some good hitters and not a lot of ownership on them. So I think it makes sense to go to these top five on DK, especially where you can get JP Crawford, Mitch Haniger, Ty France, Kyle Seager, and Abraham Toro. It's an expensive investment in those names to do it. But overall, not one of those guys owned at even 5%. And then you've got a bunch of decent value plays at the back of this lineup. Luis Torrens is very interesting for his power at the catcher spot. He's the highest projected owned guy, but he's still under 10%. Only 4,000 for a catcher who's got 14 home runs in 333 plate appearances, a 192 ISO. He creates runs 2% better than average. You get Tom Murphy, so you get a second catcher for cheap in the back of that lineup. Murphy's got 11 home runs from the catcher spot in 289 plate appearances, so he's got a ton of power as well. Dylan Moore is a weird, baffling, interesting kind of a hitter. He's got a 174, 271, 336 triple slash, but he's hit 12 home runs, stolen 20 bases. If he could ever manage to get on first base a little bit more frequently, he'd be a really interesting player. So I think he's at least got utility for 3,800 at the bottom of the lineup, 2,200 on FanDuel. So you can just put this team together in a lot of creative ways. On the FanDuel slate, like I mentioned just before, they're extremely, extremely popular. They're negatively leveraged because they're so cheap. You get Mitch Haniger at 3,700, you get Kyle Seager at 32, and then everybody else is in the mid-2000s. And that doesn't make sense for hitters like Ty France, like Abraham Toro. Those guys are actually pretty decent. They've got a little bit of power. Toro's got a little bit of speed. They both create runs better than average. So I like the core of that lineup.
Yeah, I mean, I'm totally on board with you. I'm just rerunning my lineups right now. Something we didn't mention that somebody brought up in the YouTube chat that I think maybe we should bring up. James Kaprielian is starting for the A's today, and he was not expected to start for the A's earlier in the day, and he was just added to our data. So I wanted to refresh and read off some of these numbers because it is a favorable matchup for him against the Angels, and he's right now projecting very favorably from a leverage standpoint. James Kaprielian at 7,900 on DK is projected for 3% ownership with an 11.6% chance to be a top pitcher. Over on FanDuel at 8,300, he's projected for less than 1% ownership with a 6% chance to be the top scoring pitcher. So we get these situations in baseball, which I think are kind of different from some other sports. People are not necessarily prepared for late news or pitching change or anything like that in baseball. If Kaprielian's really going to be this low owned, 3% on DK, sub 1% on FanDuel, I think this actually makes him a pretty interesting GPP option as somebody I'm looking to add to my player pool right now. How do you feel about him?
Yeah, I like Kaprielian. I think he's a talented kid. I'm just dropping him into my model here. So give me a half a second as I talk it through. But I had noticed that Dalton Jeffries had gotten scratched, but I didn't know that it was him coming in. 8,300 is a pretty fair price for him. And I should have him translated over here momentarily. If I just click on the right thing as I'm talking about it, here we go. So we get him 7,900 on DK, 8,300 on FanDuel. I get a decent little projection on him, 24.2% strikeout rate over 105 innings, 4.65 xFIP. You can quibble with that. You can quibble with a 9% walk rate, 9.2% barrels, 42.2% hard hit. There's definitely things to look at in that contact profile, but it changes the matchup for the Angels on the other side. Their home run numbers plummet in my home run model. Their overall projections plummet from where they were in my home run model. I am going to have to turn down the volume on the Angels as in terms of what I was getting to, because they were looking pretty good in the previous matchup. And I agree. If we're getting Kaprielian basically for free in terms of ownership, then I want to grab some shares of him because I do think he's got enough talent to at least put up a reasonable start here. You know, it might not be the biggest upside spot. It might not be the, a guy who's going to smash through the roof like Corbin Burns, of course, but for the salary discount, well, now that I'm thinking that through, you're getting a major ownership discount from Nola for the same price. I'm just looking at some of these other guys. Morton, 200 more. Yeah, I still think I want to grab some shares. And it would probably come from what I was planning to allocate to Darvish, to be honest, on the FanDuel slate. I would probably pull more shares from Darvish and throw them over to Kaprielian. I don't know how much I would want to come down on the other guys who are similarly priced.
Yeah, so I just ran a set of lineups. I only got to Kaprielian at 7%, and I'm going to bump him just because based on what I expect his low ownership to be, with people just not necessarily recognizing that he was starting. Maybe if you built their lineups earlier, we're like, hey, I like my lineup. I'm not changing a pitcher because, maybe some people don't think pitchers matter, but other people do, who like my, different minds can differ on whether pitchers matter or not in MLB DFS. But James Kaprielian just being this likely low owned, only that 3% projected ownership on DK, sub 1% on FanDuel. He's somebody I'm looking to get in somewhere around 15% of my lineup. So I'm going to rerun this and try to make that happen as a reality. But also, let's see on the other side, because you said that you liked the Angels a little bit before we got that news. So now that we know that he is now going to be starting Kaprielian, how is that going to impact your outlook on Los Angeles?
Yeah, I think it's going to take them down a little bit because they were getting ownership anyway, or at least around the most interesting hitters there. I still get a decent home run projection on Jared Walsh. I think I didn't make him my actual home run pick, but he was my pick from that team. Shohei Ohtani still gets a decent home run projection. Those two guys mash against anybody, but the rest of this lineup is actually kind of bad. I think Brandon Marsh is going to be a good MLB player at some point, but he's not quite there yet. We're talking about Max Stassi, Jack Mayfield, Luis Rengifo. This is not a very top-end lineup. So I liked them before when they were projecting well in my model, but everybody dropped down in terms of the projection, except for the two prime players that everyone's going to. So I definitely want to undercut. If the field's ownership marks from where they were before hold up anyway, I definitely want to start undercutting that and pulling Angels shares. I don't really feel the need to attack Kaprielian with this team in this spot now.
Yeah, I'm just checking to see how stretched out he is because he hasn't started he started a week ago and he pitched 3 2/3 innings. That started at 5 strikeouts, 1 walk. Overall, the numbers for the year for him are solid, not great. 4.02 ERA, 4.57 expected ERA, but it's a favorable matchup, and he has pretty good strikeout stuff, 24.2% K rate for Kaprielian. This is really just a factor of ownership for me, a guy with a little bit of strikeout upside against a team that strikes out a lot, and there's just no ownership going to Kaprielian. So that's all well and good for me. The Angels, also a team that look fairly overowned now that we just got some updated ownership here, and knowing that Kaprielian is starting, going to refresh that. But it looked like the Angels were coming in significantly overowned now with this news. We have over on DK, the Angels projected for 15.5% ownership with a 5% chance to be the top scoring team on the slate. Over on FanDuel, we have the Angels with 8.2% projected ownership, 5.4% chance to be the top scoring team. By the way, that's another reason for me to want to like Kaprielian. If the Angels are going to be 15.5% owned and be arguably the most roster team over on DK, that's all the more reason to like some of the leverage that we're getting there with Kaprielian. But let's get into some offenses we actually like. We hit on Seattle, liking them as a contrarian stack. Here's a team I'm just generally confused by the ownership. The Oakland A is projected for 2.4% ownership over on DK. On FanDuel, we have Oakland projected for a more reasonable 10.9%. How is this team only picking up 2% ownership on DraftKings today?
The top 6 hitters have an average salary of $5,600, which is
that'll certainly do it. But I don't think to the point where their ownership should be this low. I mean, this is one of the more positively leveraged teams we've seen all year.
Yeah, 100%. I wrote about these guys as well. I think they're super interesting on this slate. The only guy pulling above a 5% DK ownership projection is Matt Olson, who absolutely deserves even more than he's getting here. He's at 5,700. Starling Marte is at 6,600 on this slate. That's bananas. 11 home runs, 45 stolen bases to lead the league for Marte. He's having a spectacular year. No reason to question the talent. Getting him at under 2% owned, happy to do it if you can figure out a way to pay for it. Maybe this is where your Chris Bubic shares come in. It's very difficult to put together the top 5. You do get relief with Chris Davis and Chad Pinder at the bottom of the lineup. Everybody probably knows by now that I think nothing of Elvis Andrus anymore, but he will be probably in the lineup at only 3,300, so you can offset a little bit of salary with him. I prefer Pinder out of those 3. It would probably be Pinder. Then for the home run upside, maybe a little Chris Davis and Elvis Andrus last. I just don't think much there. But yeah, I really like the idea of putting together Harrison, Marte, Olson, Chapman, Gomes, and Kana as much as I can.
And then talking about the A's over on FanDuel, where the ownership is a lot more appropriate, where they are 10.9% projected owned. What do you make of them there, where they're going to be, not massively popular, but somewhat popular, and 5x the ownership compared to what they have on DK?
I still like it because you can get Starling Marte 10-ish%. You can get Yan Gomes and his spectacular splits against the lefty under 7%, let's say, for only 2,600. It's a catcher play, so a lot of people just kind of avoid catchers on FanDuel since you don't need to play the position. But he's a spectacular power hitter, lefty-righty, so I like getting to that spot if he's in the lineup. So I just think there's enough holes in the ownership and enough cost offsets that you can kind of do it. Maybe you don't go to the level in the aggregate that the field is at. Maybe you undercut it a little bit because the popular hitters are going to be popular. That was clunky. But I think there, are ways to put this together in unique enough ways. Marcana, not all that owned. I mentioned Pinder and Chris Davis, also not all that owned on the FanDuel slate, of course, and only 2,100 and 2,200 multi-position on Pinder. So there's enough flexibility in that lineup that you can do it. And then there's a few spots where you can get under-owned pitching or under-owned second stacks to pair them with. So I like them over there too.
Yeah, it's once again a little bit different of ownership, which we see that happen from time to time, although not necessarily to this extent. Seattle's another team who are going very low owned on DK, but not so much on FanDuel now. They're pretty popular in our last FanDuel update. Yeah. But what is a stack in terms of a high end that you're looking at, and you think the ownership is maybe appropriate? So there are some teams like, let's say the Chicago White Sox, for example. They're currently projected for 14.6% ownership over on DK. On FanDuel, we have the White Sox currently projected for 12.5% ownership. So this is a team that's significantly popular, but I still don't mind getting to them. I think that ownership is very warranted, where, before we talked about the Angels being a team that's similarly owned on DraftKings, the difference is we have the White Sox with, a 15% chance to be the top scoring team on the slate compared to 5% for the Angels when the two teams are similarly owned. So to me, the White Sox, despite the ownership, is the team that I'm fine getting to. But are you okay with the ownership on Chicago?
I am. Yeah, I think they're a little bit under-owned. It looks like our top stacks tool agrees. It's been like that all day with them just at the top of the board in this matchup against Spencer Howard. I mentioned some of the things that Howard struggles with, including the walk rate. The barrel's the hard hitter, okay for Howard. He's at a 6.3% barrel rate, 34.8% hard hit on the season. But this is just a spectacular lineup. And they're the opposite of what we talked about with the Mariners and the A's, where for some reason, Luis Robert, Yohan Moncada, Jose Abreu, Yasmani Grandal, and Eloy Jimenez. The only one priced over 5,000 on DK is Yasmani Grandal. Eloy is priced at 4,000. That's bananas. John Moncada for 4,100 is ridiculous. Luis Robert, all right, you can argue that 4,800 is probably appropriate for him. Jose Abreu, 4,700, not expensive enough. So I love the idea of putting that stack together for cheap. And then you can get Gavin Sheets at 3,000 on the back end, first and outfield eligibility. Lurie Garcia, plenty of ability from him for only 3,300 at shortstop. Brian Goodwin, I mentioned every time he's in the lineup, 2,800 from the left side of the plate. Is a average-ish kind of a hitter, but he can give you a little bit of pop from the bottom of the lineup if you need to offset salary there. So I really like the idea of getting to that White Sox lineup. I think for all their popularity, yeah, they're under-owned.
Yeah, that's I'm just trying to get through the final run of my lineups. Really having the A's change their pitcher today, and then being somebody who I wanted to get, not a massive amount of exposure, wanted to get into 10 to 15% of my lineups. That's really changing the outlook of everything. So trying to run through all of that now. And one thing that is really standing out to me is I'm rerunning some of my stack percentages here. Yusei Kikuchi is a much better pitcher, I think, than he's generally getting credit for. There is a fairly high implied run total on the Kansas City Royals today. There's also a lot of ownership going to Kansas City. And Kansas City, an odd team, has picked up a lot of ownership this year because they don't have a particularly good offense. But it still seems like 2-3 times a week I look at the top stacks tool and we have a significantly negatively leveraged Kansas City Royals. They're projected for 13.4% ownership on DraftKings today with a 6.5% chance to be a top stack. I get Salvador Perez at catcher. Never an issue with that. He might lead the league in home runs from the catcher position, which is absolutely ridiculous and crazy. But why is it that the Royals end up being the chalk team of the slate like once every 3 days as a fairly poor offense overall?
I think it's a lot of people want to get to Sal and just start putting a couple bats with him to a degree. I think people maybe think some of these guys are just a little bit better than they've been all season long. You get the flashy stolen base numbers with Whit Merrifield up top, but overall for him, creating runs 7% worse than average, a 119 ISO, only 10 home runs. Not a great season for Whit outside of the stolen bases. Nicky Lopez, Andrew Benintendi, a lot of mid-range, kind of underperforming type guys. Adalberto Mondesi is a spectacular player when he's going right. 291 ISO in his 85 plate appearances, 6 home runs, 9 stolen bases, but he's missed most of the season, 85 plate appearances. So it hasn't been a great version of the lineup. They do come in cheap a lot of the time. They do have some sequential hitting ability, and like we said, the ability to steal a decent amount of bases. In addition to Merrifield, you get Nicky Lopez with 20 in this lineup, and you get 8 out of Benintendi, 9 out of Mondesi. So there's some speed here. But yeah, I think they're overrated in general by the DFS community. And you're right, Kikuchi is an effective pitcher, 24.8% strikeout rate on the year, 3.77 xFIP. He puts too many guys on base. He suffers from some hard hit issues. 9.2% walk rate, 1.27 whip, 10.9% barrel rate, 46.7% hard hit. That's a little rough, but he does all that at a 7.5 degree average launch angle. So it's not the easiest thing in the world to hit the ball out of the park against this guy. Even Sal is pressed down to just about slightly above average home run mark in my home run model. Everybody else is well below average. So I think it could be a sneaky spot for Kikuchi. And definitely if you're going to attack some of the field's ownership with a pitcher, kind of makes sense to look to this spot.
Is he somebody that you got to it all? We didn't really talk about a pitcher, and he's not really in a significant portion of my lineups. A couple lineups here or there he pops up in, but we're talking like 3-4% of lineups. Is he somebody you actually got to?
Not on the FanDuel slate, but I think if I was playing a DK slate at 7,000, I would have some shares. I did mention when we were talking about the DK options as a potential value for that 7,000 price tag. I think that's low enough where you've got upside with, you say, Kikuchi at only 3-ish% ownership on DK. Plug him in as an SP2. I mean, he at least compares favorably to Wainwright in a potentially bad spot, Alex Wood in a potentially bad spot, both for more. Certainly better than a Jose Suarez, a Chris Bubich, or any of those guys. So I just think it makes sense.
Yeah, fair enough. And let's see. Now that I have my stacks, I'll put in where am I getting to Kikuchi's right now? 4%, 3%. So yeah, he's only going to be in a few lineups for me. I get the leverage, but there's just a lot of pitchers I want to get to, and especially trying to force my way to a little bit of Kaprielian. It's just I have to take a haircut on somebody, and that's kind of something that I'm ended up getting to. I'm going to throw out a little bit of a leverage / upside stack here at you. The St. Louis Cardinals going up against Yu Darvish. As much hard contact as Yu Darvish has given up in the second half of the year, and that Darvish is going to be fairly popular today, looking at a pitcher around 20% ownership over on DK. I think this is a good spot to get leverage. He's really legitimately not pitched well recently. And it's not just that he hasn't pitched well. The offense is, the way they've scored runs has generally been home runs and extra base hits. So the Cardinals, they have a very right-hand dominant lineup, and maybe that presents some issues going up against Yu Darvish. And maybe it'll be a spot where Darvish goes out and, 6 innings, 3 runs, where he doesn't really have big upside, but doesn't really allow a whole lot of upside to the Cardinals. But I do see the home run potential here. So this is a leverage stack I'm getting to. Is it one that you like at all?
Yeah, they're coming up a little bit for me. Maybe not as aggressive as it sounds like you like them, but I do think it's a lineup that I'd get to a fair amount of the time, despite some of the quality issues that I talked about before, because I do think Tyler O'Neill's a spectacular home run hitter, and I still believe in Paul Goldschmidt, Nolan Arenado. And when I talk about the Goldschmidt and Arenado underperforming a little bit, Goldschmidt's slashing 289, 360, 495 with a 205 ISO and creating runs 31% better than average. This guy's not having a bad season by any means. It's just maybe he's not smashing through the roof of my original expectations for him. Arenado, similar story, 32 home runs and a 245 ISO. Where Arenado struggles is a little bit in the hit tool in the triple slash, 255, 311, 500, still creating runs 14% better than average. But I expect more from a superstar of Nolan Arenado's caliber. Maybe some of that got eaten up by the Coors Field factor, and I have to adjust my expectations going forward. But there are capable hitters in this lineup around him, with Tommy Edman, with Dylan Carlson in there, with Harrison Bader in there. Mundo Sosa's all right for cheap in the infield. So it's a lineup that you can put together easy enough. They're not expensive, and there is that major home run upside through at least 2, 3, and 4 in that lineup that you can definitely convince me that Yu Darvish is targetable with those 3 hitters. So I would focus on having all 3 of those guys in a stack and then building with the other pieces. That's kind of obvious. That's kind of where the ownership's going to be anyway, but there's not a lot of people here. So it makes sense.
Yeah. And I'm going to, it's always, I never know quite how to, where it's like, you're agreeing with me. I want to agree with you agreeing with me, but it's kind of like, oh, good point, Terry, but you're already agreeing with me. So then it would just kind of me be patting myself on the back, but I agree with everything you said there, Terry. We've got a lot of chat right now in the, a lot of comments right now in the YouTube chat about Shohei Ohtani, and Ohtani has gotten down to a ridiculously cheap price tag over on DK. He is 4,600. That is the cheapest he's been. When is the last time Ohtani was 4,600? He hasn't even been really below 6,000 much recently. Last game he was at 54, but before that he hadn't been below 6,000 since August 10th. So it had been a while. The last time 4,600. The last time he was below 5,000. Now even then we have to go back to like June, the start of the season. So Ohtani is struggling right now. And I kind of think that it's going maybe a little bit overlooked. There's been a little discussion like, hey, who should win MVP, Ohtani, Vlad? And everybody's making the case it's because of how well Vlad's playing and pushing Toronto to a playoff berth potentially. But something that's kind of sneakily hidden there, by the way, I still think Ohtani should be running away with the MVP at this point. Ohtani has not been good for a considerable amount of time at the plate now. The last time Ohtani hit a homer was September 4th. And in general, there's been a lot of weak games for him, but the price point to me still makes him somebody who I very much want to get to. He's one of my most rostered individual hitters. But what do you make of that 4,600 price tag for Ohtani on DK?
I think it's an overreaction to maybe a bit of a slump, a little bit of a slide from a guy who's just been absolutely on fire through the entire season. So if in conjunction with a price going down, we also get an ownership dip based on maybe an improved pitcher from who we thought they were originally going to be facing. He just looked super, super popular to me earlier on the DK slate at almost 40% ownership for that price. So I just get concerned rostering any individual hitter. It could be Babe Ruth in there, and you could still get the concern that he's going to go 0 for 4 and give you a big fat 0 at 40% ownership. You're just going down with the ship with most of the field there. I'd rather just get to another spot. So he'd be a guy who's popular for me in a full crunch, but probably not to the level that the field is, even at that spectacular price. That said, I'd mentioned the hard hit rate, the barrel rate that Kaprielian gives up. Certainly a targetable guy for home run upside. Ohtani's got a monster number in my home run model. He's at, to give it away, it's a 17.42 right now in my home run model. And anything over 10 means you've got a well above average chance. That is I think, still top mark of the day. Top mark of the day for Shohei Ohtani. So obviously my model likes it. It makes a lot of sense in terms of the upside, in terms of the talent of the player. It's just whether you can ride with that much popularity.
Yeah, and we have, by the way, looking at sportsbook odds and where they have Ohtani projected to homer, he is plus 250 to homer today. Not a good bet whatsoever, but plus 250, that is by far the most likely home run odds of anybody on today's slate. So at least sportsbook are still looking at Ohtani and saying, hey, this is a guy who's fairly likely to home run today. So as a one-off, I still think that getting to him is quite favorable. And for cash games on DK, despite the recent struggles, go ahead and play Ohtani. There's going to be very few times you could ever play this guy for 4,600, and the 30% ownership, maybe a little rich for tournaments because that's kind of aggressive for any individual hitter. But I mean, still going back to the actual 4,600 price tag, I've just been scrolling through his game log to see when the last time he was $4,600 or cheaper. Would you like to wager a guess the last time that Shohei Ohtani was priced $4,600 or less expensive?
June 23rd, my sister's birthday.
May 16th against Nathan Eovaldi. It's been a minute. And by the way, in that game, he homered, and that was a stretch. He had homered 3 games in a row. So listen, Ohtani to me, still the AL MVP. Maybe Vlad make this a little closer than it would seem down the stretch of the season if Vlad's going to continue to just tear up the league and Ohtani's going to continue to struggle, but probably not the most likely outcome. A few minutes left here to go, Terry. We got about 10 minutes left until lock, but any other stacks we have not yet mentioned that you think we should be talking about here?
Let me jump. I was just looking at Vladdy's Triple Crown chase numbers, and we talked about it earlier a couple months ago, and I'd love to see the kid get there. That would be fascinating. And then it would be fascinating if he didn't win the MVP while doing that. Let's see. Going back to the stacks board, looks like the Astros are pretty overowned. We talked about Oakland. We talked about the Mariners and the White Sox. A lot of teams that are getting strange over ownership, at least as of the last update. The Angels, you mentioned, we're pulling a ton of ownership there. I think the Braves just are, anytime I can get the Braves lineup is just on general talent, on general power upside. I'm happy to do it if they're going at positive leverage. And as of the last time I reloaded this page, they were. So I can get to shares of Ozzie Albies, Jorge Soler, Freddie Freeman, Austin Riley, Adam Duvall. I'll throw Travis d'Arnaud and Dansby Swanson into that mix as well. Everybody owned under 5%. And another team that is inexplicably underpriced on the DK slate. They priced up the Mariners for today and the A's today, and then they cut the Braves despite all their quality. Austin Riley, 4,500. That's a mistake. Adam Duvall, 4,100. Mistake. Travis d'Arnaud, 38. Dansby Swanson, 39. Jorge Soler, 37. The only 2 guys over 5,000, Freddie Freeman and Ozzie Albies. I think that's an interesting team. And they cross across both sites, single-digit ownership on FanDuel as well. Going up against Alex Wood, 25.3% strikeout rate. He's been good through the season, but still gives up a 41.2% hard hit rate. Keeps it down 7.7-degree average launch angle. But just with guys who know how to elevate the ball and just such a significant home run hitting lineup, I'm happy to take under-owned shares of Braves.
Yeah, that's also a team I'm slightly overweight to. No issue there. Atlanta positively leveraged on both sites. Here's a team that has pretty significantly different ownership on FanDuel versus DraftKings, the Houston Astros, who I think on FanDuel are much more appealing looking than over on DK, because on DraftKings right now, we have Houston projected for 18.6% ownership. This is going to be the most popular team on the slate according to our latest ownership update. So I think that they bear us talking about a little bit. And Houston, if you want to play some of these guys in cash games, that's fine. Small percentage of them in tournaments. I have a very light amount of them, but definitely nowhere near what the field has. Houston Astros, 18.6% ownership. And as a team, the individual ownership here also. Yordan Alvarez, 23.9%. Kyle Tucker, Alex Bregman, Jose Altuve, Chas McCormick. These guys are all north of 20%. I understand why people are getting to them as price plays, as individual options. But as a 5-man stack, there's so much ownership here. I'm underweight to every single hitter individually. And listen, these guys certainly are good plays just on a points per dollar basis, also based on their overall potential. But for me personally, I'm getting to a bunch of these guys at 10%, where they're coming in over 20%. What do you make of the ownership going to Houston on DK? And what are you doing with them on FanDuel, where they look a little bit more appropriately owned?
Yeah, so I was getting to share some of them on my FanDuel crunch that I was running in the background here a pretty decent amount of the time. In my actual entries, I may still come in under the field, or probably more accurately around the field. As you're talking about the individual ownership shares, everybody out there who's watched us more than once through the season probably knows I was thinking about Yuli Gurriel, who is projected among all those guys. He's hitting cleanup and he's owned under 10%. It's inexplicable. Dude's creating runs 34% better than average, 313, 379, 461 on the season. He is a major cog in that offense who's never owned. 3,300 on FanDuel, 4,400 on DK. That's my favorite bat on the team. But yeah, I think they make some sense to string together where they're a little bit under owned, or at least efficiently owned on the FanDuel slate. And I'd probably look to undercut on DK and just go to one of those underpriced teams, despite a very, very good matchup here against Humberto Castellanos.
Yeah, and what were you going to say?
I was going to ask if you remember the guy who used to play in the WSOP, who used to go, he was named Umberto, presumably. And every time he won a big hand, he would go, Umberto, like that. That's what I think of.
I don't remember. You know who definitely would, though, if he was producing? Tyler. Tyler was into like those World Series of Poker NFTs, which he was talking about for a little bit. Then he went off and he was building his own NFTs. Who knows where he's at with that project? But yeah, I guarantee you, if we bring that up, you remember. I do not, but I do remember the World Series of Poker excitement, where all of a sudden we were all watching on TV. We were all playing poker. Me and my friends. When I was in middle school, I made like a spoof video of rounders with my friends. That was like a film project I did for one class. So yeah, but I was into the World Series of Poker at one point, but I did not remember that particular player.
Yeah, really like a flamboyant guy. Fun. I actually played with him at the Taj at like 3 a.m. one night in like a low limit, like 1-2 game. And he was doing that there at one.
That's actually upsetting.
Like, wow.
That's upsetting.
That's fun.
Yeah, that's like BoJack Horseman type. Just the washed up famous guy who's still doing the catchphrase everywhere. Any other offenses here that we want to bring up? If not, we could go over to some home run calls.
Let me just take a look. What else came up in the old crunch here? Let me flip back over to that one. Click on this guy. I got to remove the filter here. We talked about the Royals, who I don't really like, and they're getting filtered out through my process here. They were coming up a decent amount in the crunch, which I think goes to what we were just talking about before, about how popular they become in weird situations. And I think it's largely price driven. But yeah, the teams that I really want to get to are the ones we've talked about. I don't think much of that Milwaukee lineup. I think the Cubs are in a terrible spot, so we don't want to go to the bad teams, obviously. Out of the good teams on this slate, maybe the Padres, they're coming up a decent amount of the time for me. They're going up against Wainwright, so there's going to be at least a decent amount of balls in play. I think Wainwright's a talented guy. I think he's most likely going to put up like a clean start here, maybe give up 3-4 runs. We talked about how they only create runs around the league average, but the pricing is down. There are some talented guys in that lineup, like getting Tommy Pham for 2,300 hitting fifth is a discount in any situation. Manny Machado, not all that expensive at 35, Jake Cronenworth at 29. So I was getting to a decent amount of these guys on the FanDuel slate as well, just in crunches. If I ran a full 150 through my sorting process here, I'm playing less than that like we do when we're on live before lock. But if I ran the full 150, I'd be curious to see how much they came up for me, because I did get to a pretty decent amount of them and wasn't necessarily expecting that with how much I was expecting to get to Wayno.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you a little more of a follow-up here, because I know this is going to rile up some people in the chat who are into Adam Wainwright before. Is this a team? I know you mentioned that you like them in terms of just what their leverage odds are, but are you getting to them fairly heavily, or is it just think you're a little bit overweight to the field because of how low owned they are?
So it looks like just on pure projection, point per dollar, how FC calculates things, they came up a lot more than I was expecting them to. So putting it through the wash, yeah, I think I would probably be above where I thought I would be. And given that most of these guys are in single digits, I would probably come in above the field on most of these guys and maybe be undercut to the field, the 15% ownership on Fernando Tatis, although that's not totally terrible. He's 4,500 shortstop and outfield eligibility, so he helps you put together the lineup in interesting ways. You don't need to pivot off of Tatis by any means, but I think if I'm going to be underweight to one guy and over on the others, it would probably be set up that way. But yeah, I think I'll be above the field on in a full slate of lineups on the pods.
All right, let's do some home run calls here, and then we could call it a night, and everybody could start building their football lineups, because always one DFS sport after another. But guys, do us a favor, like this video, subscribe to the YouTube channel. We're gonna have football content. We run it's like 5 hours in a row of football content on Sunday mornings. It never stops. So you want to know when that's going to be starting up. But home run calls, Terry. Talked about your home run model a little bit before and how Shohei Ohtani was still popping up in it, even though he struggled a little bit lately. But who's going to be your official home run call for the night?
So the official home run call that everybody can always find in the tournament strategy article, which is free on the site every day, Mr. Mitch Haniger from the Seattle Mariners. We talked about liking them. I think the two of us like them a lot today. I've got him 6th overall on the board behind a few very obvious names. Sometimes I don't like to go to the most obvious guys. Those names were Shohei Ohtani, Fernando Tatis, Matt Olson, Pete Alonso, and Jared Walsh. Those are the only guys above him. I think Mitch Haniger, for all his prowess as a home run hitter, maybe a little bit more under the radar than those guys. So I'll go with Mitch.
Yeah, I'm going to look at our home run model here. Not maybe the most likely out of homer. There's a couple things here that I think is interesting. Brandon Crawford is plus 875 to hit a homer today, and plus 825 is the number. Not that we have him being that likely to homer, but We have him homering 13% of the time. That makes a plus 825 bet pretty significant plus ROI. DraftKings, I don't find any real need to get to him as a play. But I do think it's crazy to think that he's 6,000 on DraftKings today. So you're talking about a guy who's 6,000 on DK, but then there's also plus 825, did a homer today. And, just kind of some interesting information there. So Brandon Crawford, plus 825, clearly against Charlie Morton. It's not the most likely spot for him to hit a homer. We're talking about a guy who's having a career best power year. And it's hard for me to think that Crawford should ever be plus 825 at this point in the season.
Yeah, I mean, just based on that price, that's definitely a one worth considering. He doesn't project out great for me in the home run model because of the matchup against Morton, a guy who allows a 32.5% hard hit, only a 5.1% barrel rate, and a 7.3-degree average launch angle. But for that price, makes a ton of sense to go to a guy who's at a 43% hard hit rate and an 11.7% barrel rate on the season, has hit 21 home runs, and has a 225 ISO and 491 plate appearances. I like that call for that price, absolutely.
All right. And with that said, that is going to do it for us today, guys. Do us a favor, hit that like video, hit the like on the video on the way out. Also subscribe to our YouTube channel, and everybody, good luck tonight.